Hello everyone, this is Michael from the Intersight team. I wanted to show you Cisco's cloud management platform and how we can provision a Kubernetes cluster in just a few clicks. So right now we're still in the monitoring tab where you can observe your storage, servers, and everything else you have running in your data center. Let's navigate down here to orchestration, where we have already created a workflow that allows us to provision a Kubernetes cluster. So this workflow is something that an end user could actually pick up and use to create a workflow. So this will configure all of the settings that we need in Intersight and provision the cluster for them. Now, you don't need to know anything about Kubernetes to do all of that. The entire Kubernetes deployment is already built by Intersight. All this does is basically configure everything for the end user. For the end user, you will have a set of inputs that you can modify. So for example, if you want to restrict the CPU or memory options or something else, you can change the workflow inputs to basically give certain options to the end user or not give them certain options, which we will be able to see once we go into the execute screen. So let's save it to have the latest state, and then let's go execute. So this is what an end user would then see, which is just a set of options where the end user can, for example, say, what should be the name of my cluster? So let's call it DevNet. Then I can pick a version from the version selector here. Let's go with this one. We will need an SSH key, which is needed to SSH to the Kubernetes nodes, to the Kubernetes VMs. If you want, you could also just provide this out of the box, in which case the end user wouldn't have to provide their own SSH key. Now let's continue down. We need to select a target where we want to deploy our Kubernetes cluster. Let's go with this one here. And below that, we just have a few settings like how many load balancers do we want to configure, how many nodes do we want to have, what type of nodes do we want to have, what size. So in this case, let's go for size L. And it's up to you to basically provide any t-shirt size that you want for the end user. Now let's go ahead and execute this workflow. So once we press execute, our workflow will start running and it will create all of those settings in Intersight and start provisioning our cluster. Now, this will probably take 15 to 30 minutes depending on the size of cluster you have. So let's fast forward and let's have a look at our finished cluster. Okay, so we can see our newly provisioned cluster right here. Let's go and navigate into that interface. You can see our cluster is up and running. All of our nodes are created, both control plane and worker nodes. And we can also see that here in the operate view, where we can now see that all of our nodes have been assigned an IP address. The one IP address we're looking for is one of our control plane IPs, for example, this one. And we're going to need that because we will need to establish an SSH connection to that node to deploy Kubeflow on it. To do that, we will have to add the SSH connection as a target in Intersight. So we will go here and click on SSH endpoint. And let's just give this endpoint a name. So just now we picked up the IP address, so 10.51.71.91. Then we're using key-based authentication with the key that we also used for installing the Kubernetes cluster. And now we're gonna copy-paste the private key in here. And let's just click claim. That will establish the connection to the SSH endpoint for us, which will then allow us to run further workflows on it. You could automate this whole claim as part of your deployment process as well, but we really wanted to show you how all the steps work together. Okay, now that we have claimed our target, we can navigate back to orchestration, and now we can run another workflow. Now we're going to deploy Kubeflow on our newly deployed Kubernetes cluster. So this workflow, basically what it does, it downloads the source files for Kubeflow, it downloads Customize, and then in the last step, it uses Customize to build those source files and deploy them on our cluster. So you don't really need to know anything about the inner workings. That's all handled by the workflow for you. So when we click on execute, what we will have to do is we will have to select our SSH target that we created, DevNet. Then we enter our Kubeflow version that we want to have installed on this cluster, for example, 1.5. And in case we're using a proxy, we can define that in here. So we can just provide the URL of our proxy that we are going to use for downloading all of those files. Okay, now let's go ahead and execute our workflow, which will start downloading the files and installing Kubeflow on our cluster. Okay, and as you can see now, Kubeflow has been completely installed on our cluster and is ready to use. So the only thing that we want to do in Intersight is we want to go over here to Kubernetes and we want to download our kubeconfig. Okay, and now with this kubeconfig we can access our Kubernetes cluster. Now that we have downloaded our kubeconfig, we're ready to get started with Kubeflow. Let's recap what we did. We deployed a Kubernetes cluster on Cisco Intersight Workload Engine, and then we deployed Kubeflow on top of it, which we're going to explore in the next video. Stay tuned.